I did something that most owners of this book will never do. I read it. That's supposed to be a joke, but it's also not entirely a joke. Communion is the kind of book that exists as a Facebook prop that you put next to a cup of coffee that probably says liberal tears on the mug, and then you take a picture of it and you post it to Instagram because you want people around you to know a certain political thing about you. I'd wager for this particular book, Communion by J.D. Vance, that the ratio of copies purchased to copies finished is rivaled only by A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. The difference, of course, is that Stephen Hawking was trying to explain the universe, and J.D. Vance is attempting to simply explain himself. And unfortunately, after reading all 300 pages of this book, I am convinced that Stephen Hawking knows more about black holes than J.D. Vance knows about J.D. Vance.
Oh, snap!
Before I dive into the analysis of the book itself, I want to offer a quick aside about its stylistic prose, because it was unique to say the least. More importantly, I want to talk about its lack of any discernible voice. I think its lack of a discernible voice is actually being read in my head as something more of a remedial voice. What I'm really trying to say is that this book reads like something at a 9th or 10th grade level. It seems intentionally simple. So one of two things is being done here, because J.D. Vance has a law degree from Yale. I believe he's capable of higher quality writing. The first plausible option is this is simply how J.D. Vance thinks and writes. I truly hope that this is not the highest possible level of intellectual rigor that J.D. Vance can manage, because if that's the case, it means that a Yale law degree means very little. I would sincerely hope that someone who is second in line for presidency of the United States has a higher intellectual capacity than what I read in this book. The second option is that this book was intentionally distilled down to an 8th or a 9th grade reading level because the readers of this book are likely to have that reading level.
And here at the Derek Zoolander Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good and who want to learn to do other stuff good too.
If I'm being honest, I think this is the correct read. I think that the people who are buying this book don't have the intellectual capacity to meld ideas from this particular book with ideas from other books, because they're probably not the type of people who read. This book will be something they read if and only if the power goes out sometime around the time Fox and Friends is on, if you are 50, 60, or 70 years old in a flyover state. Yes, I know what I'm saying here is somewhat demeaning to Donald Trump voters, but I think that that accuracy is well earned. Donald Trump himself famously said that he loves the poorly educated.
We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
Now that my preface is out of the way, let's get to the substance of this book, if you want to call it substance, because I don't actually know that there's anything substantial enough here to call it substance to be somewhat self-referential. Quick asides, right before I was going to record this video, Queen Lindsey Graham, the Queen of South Carolina, passed away. So I'm offering this asides as a note that J.D. Vance is next in line to the presidency of the United States. And I think we have all observed that Donald Trump is famously in somewhat poor health right now. So not only is this book important from the context of the Vice President of the United States, old people, elderly people who are unwell, which Donald Trump is, can grow ill very quickly and not recover. The possibility that J.D. Vance is the next president of the United States sometime in the next 2 years is not a small probability. It's probably more likely than it is unlikely. I did not plan on making a preface for this video trying to juxtapose the biology of the human condition with the longevity and chronology of presidential terms. They just happen to collide at this particular time because of the context. There are hard limitations on human longevity, and Donald Trump is currently pushing up against those limitations. Those limitations may mean the man who wrote this book could be your president. That's why we need to review it. Let's just get this out of the way up front. J.D. Vance is a total failure, And it is extremely weird saying that about the Vice President of the United States.
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
I'm going to tell you what I found both fascinating and horrifying in the same way that I find a car crash to be both fascinating and horrifying. J.D. Vance and I are kind of the same person on paper. We come from the same place in rural Appalachia. We're about the same age. We both have 3 kids. We're both married to women who are probably our intellectual superior, but we're not capable of admitting it. We're both basically the same guy, minus the eyeliner and the couch fucking.
That couch has a lot of memories.
We both became successful adults through different permutations of our careers. We both rub elbows with technologists who are big in Silicon Valley. And I want to say all of these things are fine. It is okay to have different eras to your career and be successful at different things. It is good to be a well-rounded, successful person in different areas. And yet, despite all of our commonalities, we arrived at very different places. More than anything he's ever said on a debate stage, this book explains why he is the way he is. I read this book with a pen in my hand, taking copious notes in real time because I wanted to capture exactly what I was thinking as I was reading the book. Ultimately, I ended up reading a book about a man who has no idea who he is. The book opens with his grandmother, who he calls Mama. I also had a mama, a familiar Southern colloquialism, and so I started the book with genuine warmth. Immediately, something strange happens when he's discussing his grandmother and her foundation on Christianity. J.D. Vance frames his first interrogations of religion through his grandmother, despite his grandmother having few representations of what Christianity actually means in her lived life. Owning firearms and having a folksy way of talking are not uniquely Christian attributes. They are just folksy Southern and Appalachian anecdotes that are applied to a person. Then it gets better. His grandmother hated televangelists. Mama saw televangelists as showmen who stood on stage and lied about who they are.
Faith Tonight presents Uplifting Figures, Baby Billy Freeman.
She understood that televangelists used the language of the Christian faith to enrich themselves, and she found it repulsive. Vance quotes her directly in his book. One in particular, a man named Benny Hinn, would wave his hand flamboyantly, often making a guttural noise or screaming, and entire rows of his followers would fall over as if they'd been hit by an especially potent dose of the Holy Spirit. We'd watch this in amazement, me wondering whether it was real, and Mama wondering how the hell anyone fell for it. They're all crazy, she'd say, a little stunned by the spectacle. And he's an effing crook. Mama had good instincts. We'll get back to crooks who use Christianity as a crutch later. She was right, of course. Using one's Christian faith to extract wealth and resources from others does make you a crook. And the man who wrote that very sentence in this book went on to hitch his entire political career to a man in Donald Trump who has more in common with televangelists than he does with modern politicians. Donald Trump is the televangelist model of politics. I am one of you. Give me your unquestioning loyalty, your money, and your vote. J.D. Vance transcribed his own mama, describing his future boss, and did it with no self-awareness whatsoever. In this book, there's also this genuinely sweet story in the opening stretch when he talks about how he reconnected with his father, and his father's church ended up pooling money together to buy a van for a man who needed a van for work and also transportation. Of course, this is the social enterprise that Jesus Christ actually espoused. The Jesus Christ of literature in the Bible is functionally a socialist. He preaches against wealth accumulation and for the power of wealth distribution for community provisions. In his book, Vance describes the purchase of this van by his father's church as beautiful. He writes it down in his book. And then he spends the rest of his career, and also this book, working actively against exactly that type of community power. This book is filled to a surfeit with the familiar type of Christianity tropes that will be intimately familiar to anyone who grew up in the rural evangelical South. They are written for an audience that is primed for these types of narratives, and J.D. Vance, of course, delivers. So, of course, we need to cue the story about the time God saved his life. Page 26 gives us the hallmark of every great Christian memoir, the unexplainable event that is actually easily explainable. The time God saved his life. J.D. Vance was leaving his grandmother's funeral. He was distraught, depressed, and he had tears in his eyes. It began to rain, and he was driving too fast for the road conditions. His car hits a puddle. It skids, hydroplanes. He's heading towards a guardrail. He could go over the edge of the embankment, but miraculously, his car stops. His life is spared by the grace of God, or so the trope goes. In his book, J.D. Vance says perhaps a gust of wind stopped his car. Really, bro? A gust of wind? Stopping a 4,000-pound vehicle going 60 miles an hour? Come on. I can explain what happened. It was anti-lock brakes and tire science. This is a recurring pattern that I hear from the evangelical community, and I've heard this story more times from more preachers than I can count. God saved his life. I cannot count how many times in my life I have been in a Baptist congregation and the pastor stands on stage and says, God should have taken my life in that moment, but God spared me. Can I get an amen? No. Teams of engineers saved your life. Materials scientists saved your life. People who understand crumple zones to make cars more safe. They saved your life. Tire scientists saved your life. Electrical engineers who understand how to tune ABS systems saved your life. There are thousands of people around the world who've dedicated their entire careers to making sure your car stops in time. But if it can't stop in time, that the airbag deployment and the crumple zones are managed effectively, and that the passenger compartment maintains its integrity so you can walk away from the accident. That's not God. That's investments in science and technology. And every time a person attributes automotive engineering excellence to divine intervention, an engineer loses their wings. The chapter Semper Why goes into detail about why he divorced himself from Christianity circa 2007 when he was in the Marines. He goes into detail about why he lost his faith, but I'd argue that based upon the way I read it, he never really had any faith. His younger conception of faith was almost entirely rooted in being pro-life. That was its entire edifice. He talks about Terry Schiavo and the feeding tube debate, and this whole description of morality between life and death. These are topics that I think should be discussed, but they are better discussed in books like Being Mortal by Dr. Atul Gawande. Life and death are inherently complex topics, but the fact that American Christians have rooted so much of their cultural identity on top of the pro-life movement tells me that it's not really about Christianity, and it's more about control.
Does that feel hypocritical to you?
Well, it's about control and also having a divisive wedge issue, which also happens to be a remarkable fundraising vehicle.
Are you ready to make this money?
J.D. Vance has the same misunderstanding with community. He understands why it was necessary for the church to pitch in for the van and his father's congregation, so the man could perform work and get groceries, etc. What he can't understand is that the purchase of that van was the entire idea behind the teachings of Jesus Christ, that mutual community provision is not a side effect of church attendance. It's the entire point of Christianity. J.D. Vance treats Christianity as a set of observable things that you can reproduce rather than a set of values, which is why he thinks his grandmother's prolific use of the F word is somehow antithetical to the ideas of Christianity, when they're not at odds with each other at all, because the Bible says remarkably little about the use of the F word. J.D. Vance spends a lot of time in this book worrying about the construction of Christianity rather than its teachings or its values. It's clear that he sees Christianity as an aesthetic or a brand and not a way that you should hold yourself or contribute to society. I grew up in this world, in the poor rural South, in a little town called Barnardsville, North Carolina, just about 40 miles north of Asheville, closer to the Tennessee border than it is to Asheville. I can tell you, the brand of Christianity that is practiced in the rural South has much more to do with community and a reason to gather on Sunday and Wednesday than it does about understanding the Bible or any sort of intellectual or educational practices about the teachings of Christ. Churches function more as community centers rather than places of scholarship and learning.
It was actually at this Baptist church that I first began to understand what homophobia and bigotry were, because I distinctly remember being 9 or 10 years old and hearing the preacher talk about gay people, and it seemed out of bounds with a message of love and compassion and understanding. Watching the sunrise over the mountains this morning as morning was breaking really reminded me of why I love it so much here and why people stay. And there's this narrative, and I think it comes from people like me that live in larger, more built-up urban city centers, like where I am in Northern Virginia, the DC metro. And people say, oh, why would you live out here? There's no opportunity out here. You know, the socioeconomic differences, yada, 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 right? Some people just don't want to live in highly built-up urban areas. It's not comfortable for them, and so they stay here. So if you're going to stay here, and you know that people don't want to leave because this is their home, how do we better serve these populations so they feel like they're more part of the world?
This is why I think Christianity works so uniquely well in the rural evangelical South, because people live isolated from each other. So the community centers, which are these churches, are places where people can gather. This is why I think in larger cities like New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Seattle, churches are less of a community center and more of a place of scholarship. You don't need churches as a place of community when you have many other alternatives for community centers in your area. J.D. Vance grew up inside a Christian community center and mistook the community center's building for belief. The chapter Semper Why ends somewhat hilariously with J.D. Vance's discovery of who else? Ayn Rand, and he adopts objectivism because rugged individualism is what unspecial men need to tell themselves they have in order to disregard the effects of community. He tells us in the book that Rand's philosophy fills the void that was left when he discarded Christianity. Oh boy. Of course it did. Rand's protagonists tend to be people like J.D. Vance. They're people from humble backgrounds who, against all odds, overcame everything thanks to their rugged individualism. These ideas are catnip for anyone who needs to believe that their success is solely because of their own efforts. The idea that you're successful because of the people around you, the community, your friendships, mentorship, the roads you drove across, and shared infrastructure, this is poison to people like J.D. Vance who need to believe that they are very special boys because they are unique and special. J.D. Vance's adoption of Ayn Rand tells us that he needs to be the singular hero of his own story. And here in the book, 67 pages in, we have our first real breakthrough idea. The breakthrough idea here is that J.D. Vance has no idea who he is. This is an adult man who has changed his name 2 times in his adult life. This is extremely uncommon. Changing your name this far along in your adult life twice is the desperate attempt, the yearning of a man who in his own millennial way is trying to rebrand himself as a new person, a reinvention of what could be J.D. Vance. This is really a hallmark of the millennial identity groupthink, as if rebranding yourself will allow you to self-actualize in a way that you didn't before. This is a man who, in his life, has tried to describe himself as many things. A Marine, a book writer, a Christian, a father, a senator, a vice president, an objectivist,
butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker.
And each time he wears the idea like a costume rather than actually trying to understand what these things could possibly mean. In his book, he says he never became a true objectivist, that he simply disregarded Christianity and adopted some of the ideas of objectivism, which is a nice way of saying you've still got objectivism, but the tags are on it. And in my opinion, if you're going to do objectivism, at least have the courtesy of cutting the tags off so I know that you're not just wearing the outfit to return it later. I want to be fair to J.D. Vance here if I can. A lot of us spend time on our 20s not knowing what the hell is going on in our own heads. I called it being 24. Taylor Swift famously said, "I don't know about you, but I'm feeling 22." What is abnormal is attaching yourself to every idea that comes by you because you think attachment to it will give your life some definition or meaning. It won't, and it didn't. The Marines didn't, Christianity didn't, objectivism didn't. None of these ideas will give your life meaning if you don't have a sense of self. And that's because there is no idea that's a strong enough substitute for self. Chapter 3 opens with the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862, which is a real piece of legislation that did open many colleges and universities in the United States, including Ohio State University, which J.D. Vance attended. Nobody disputes that the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862 was a broad success, but the tone of the book, you can tell J.D. Vance is winding up to undermine higher education. And buddy, he delivers. The detail that stopped me cold was, of course, the reference the chapter itself is referencing, which is a book by Tucker Max, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell. For those of you who were blessedly offline in the early 2000s, Tucker Max was a blogger, and his book, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell, was a meandering tale of alcoholism and how he mistreated women. The takeaway from I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell is that drinking to excess is good and treating women as disposable is better, apparently, allegedly, according to Tucker Max. J.D. Vance describes his college experience the way that many young men do. It was a monument to drinking and misunderstanding relationships with women and seeing them as accessory pieces rather than autonomous people with their own agencies, ideas, and goals. What's telling about this chapter is, even now, he still tends to frame women in exactly that role in light 20 years later. J.D. Vance blames the culture for shaping him. He cites songs like, I can't make this up, Ayo Technology by 50 Cent and Crank That by Soulja Boy as being part of the zeitgeist that shaped this moment. Those are choices that he made. He could have picked any songs. Those are the songs he picked. I'm not making them up. And yes, I will acknowledge that during this time frame, those artists existed. But so did Bright Eyes. So did Death Cab for Cutie. You could have chosen songs with more emotional depth that had relationships that were maybe a little non-functional, but described people as complex and not women as accessories. In this world that he's describing, because we're the same age, in 2007, there was an entire world of music and media that was full of emotional depth and nuance. It was one click away. No one force-fed you Tucker Max, man. J.D. Vance chose that, and his refusal to see his choices as choices is going to become a recurring theme throughout this book. Before I go any further, I'm going to say something positive about J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance graduated from Yale Law School. Getting into Yale Law School is difficult to do. The coursework is difficult. Getting a degree from Yale Law is a genuine accomplishment, and no one should disrespect that. No one should ever accuse J.D. Vance of being lazy or unintelligent, because those are two things that he is clearly not. What's interesting, however, is how J.D. Vance frames Yale in his book. Pawpaw dies, the family becomes poor, and then he manages to scratch his way into Yale Law, where he is an outsider. So why does J.D. Vance position himself as the outsider in his own book. Well, consider the audience. The people buying communion and reading communion are overwhelmingly going to be evangelical Christians who are Trump voters who would never in a million years find themselves in a lecture hall at Yale Law School. So the book keeps whispering, "Don't worry, I know I went to Yale Law School, but I'm really one of you." This political memoir is functionally the equivalent of a country singer who is singing songs about dirt roads, but has a 600-acre ranch in Franklin, Tennessee, and simply forgets to mention that the dirt road that they're singing about in their song has a winery right there, and also there are vineyards on either side of the dirt road. But it's still a dirt road, right, guys?
And at the end of this dirt road, this is where I grew up. There's nothing else out here. There's the house, which apparently is called Wild House now. And I drove a little bit further up the road, and there's a campsite up there. People used to go camping up the way a lot. Basically, one more quarter mile up, there's this old logging road, and people used to go hiking and camping in the logging road. Although, it's kind of funny because I'm actually seeing signs of bears around right now, so I'm like keeping my head on a swivel because I saw bear tracks when I was walking up over here. But this is the little creek where I used to go fishing for trout. It's a peaceful way of living, and I understand why people want to live out here and come out here. It's nice, it's peaceful, it's serene. And, you know, if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably live here again. It's awesome. Now, I think we need to have a bigger conversation about what it means to be out here. Not the tourists and the people who come out here because they like it, because it's serene, but the people who kind of have to be here because financially they don't have better options.
J.D. Vance needs to play the role of the guy from poor rural Appalachia because he wants to connect with his blue-collar, probably not college-educated audience. What he doesn't want to tell you is that he liked it there, and he likes the lifestyle. Then there's this passage which I want to quote directly, because I found it revealing. "I started to grasp the devious hidden costs of the system. Work as much as you can, achieve as much as you can, make as much money as you can. And if that means you don't have time for the kids, fine. If that means you don't even have kids, all the better. I thought these people were enlightened compared to the evangelical questions I'd left behind, but I began to see they were as screwed up as anyone." What J.D. Vance is discovering here in his third year of Yale Law School is that people have failings. Evangelicals in Appalachia have failings. Yale elites have failings. People have failings whether they're Christian or not Christian. To err is human. People are just people. And the fact that he needed to put Yale on a pedestal first before he became disillusioned with Yale tells us a lot about J.D. Vance and how he views the world. First comes the idol, then disillusionment. Then he pivots. Then there's a new idol. Then there's disillusionment. Then he pivots. Wash, rinse, repeat. And I need to be transparent here and break the fourth wall for just a second. My life got a lot easier when I got out of poor rural Appalachia and arrived where I am today in a wealthy neighborhood in Northern Virginia. My life is better now that I have money and there's German luxury cars in the driveway. My life is better because I have money. Do I still have stressors in my life? Absolutely. But my stressors are white-collar stressors. My problems are the Yale problems that J.D. Vance describes in his book, but they're not problems that are going to limit my ability to put a roof over my head, provide food for my family, or even limit my prospects in any meaningful way. The intellectual dishonesty that J.D. Vance is performing here is that he says that the stressors of rural Appalachia and coastal elites are comparable, but they're not. What it tells me is he didn't understand the difference between his lived experience and the lived experience of the trust fund kids who were sitting next to him at Yale. What it also tells me is that J.D. Vance didn't actually meaningfully engage with his classmates. Because yes, indeed, Yale is a top flight institution and an Ivy League school. But Ivy League schools have merit-based scholarships as well. There are plenty of students at all Ivy League schools that come from humble backgrounds and humble beginnings. And if he would have talked to his classmates and engaged them in friendship and social activities, he would have discovered this. What it tells me is that J.D. Vance is comfortable replacing curiosity with assumptions and prejudice. J.D. Vance spent quite a few years at Yale, and he didn't make any friends. And listen, I'm not requiring anyone to be an extrovert, but I do think that human connection is something of the bedrock of being a public servant, because if you have trouble connecting with people, then public service is going to be a stretch for you. On page 80, J.D. Vance comes the closest he comes in this book to landing a punch anywhere. What he noted was that at Yale, nobody ever really mentioned the army of nannies, maids, dry cleaners, and assistants that make this elite lifestyle possible. And it's true. There are armies of workers that are required to make this hyper-efficient elite lifestyle function. To all this I say, fine, let's talk about it. Let me break the fourth wall again, and I'll talk about my lifestyle, because he's describing my lifestyle. My wife and I have 2 nannies, and I am extremely grateful for the work they do. I will never downplay why my nannies and the work they do really matters. Our nannies are the reason we can have 3 kids and then also work high-income jobs that required years of education. We pay our nannies above market rate. They come on vacations with us. We want them sharing their experiences with our kids. We want them talking about where they're from. Our kids have learned Spanish because one of my nannies is from Peru and the other is from Nepal. Our nannies are an extension of our family, and I'm saying that genuinely, not like in the way that rich people humble brag about having nannies. I really mean it. I consider our nannies part of our family. I am genuinely grateful for all the help and support they offer. What Vance describes is this cold callousness that is somehow structural or baked into the way that elite people must treat their staff. And what he takes away is choice. How you treat people who work in your home is a personal choice you make. Seeing this as a choice means you have to understand that some people choose to see people as people, and other people choose to see people through transactional contempt. The difference in how you treat people is something I like to call character. I think what we're seeing here in J.D. Vance is that having character is an uncomfortable frame for a guy who just wrote a book that accidentally frames every single relationship in his life as purely transactional. He discusses the Speak Up movement at Yale, which was encouraging young women to speak up more in their classes, which is probably familiar territory to anyone who has attended college or a corporate meeting or a Thanksgiving dinner. Men tend to dominate the conversation. He then brings up Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In movement, which was encouraging more women to be active participants in their own education and in the workforce, and he frames this as self-evidently bad without really supporting it in any real way. He just assumes that women working is bad. Throughout the book, J.D. Vance frames everything as, if women are working, they can't be spending time with children at home, which means that they are somehow delivering less value. In his book, he attempts to discuss the division of household labor and doing chores, and in having this discussion, he actually misses the entire point about the division of labor in the household, which was never about forcing women to do chores, but just having a discussion about what women wanted to do. You know, giving them choices. Women not having choice is going to be something of a recurring theme in this book. Heck, women not having choice is a recurring theme across the entire Republican Party, isn't it? In fact, there are so many times in this book where he talks about choices, but he doesn't seem to understand the meaning of choice. So he's just kind of like sanding down its meaning until it doesn't really have any meaning at all. Breaking the fourth wall yet again. A personal example. My wife and I made the choice to hire housekeepers. Why did we do this? Because my wife does not see scrubbing toilets as self-fulfilling in any way, and she doesn't want to do it, and I don't want her to do it. So what happens? We pay someone to do it. We have a team of first-generation immigrants who have come to the United States, and I've spoken to them in Spanish.
Hablo español.
They're wonderful women. We appreciate the hard work that they do in our household. They grew up in countries where they weren't able to get a higher education, and so they came as immigrants to the United States to pursue a better life. And they have children here. And the hope is that they'll work hard, and then their kids will get a K through 12 education. And after they receive a K through 12 education, they may go on to a trade school or a 4-year degree, or perhaps a graduate level degree. Who knows? Whatever they choose to do, they will receive the benefit of a parent who worked hard to give them more outside of a country that was their birth home. And that should be applauded. I think about these things because it's the America I understand. It's the America that I was told about by my Korean-American immigrant stepmother. I keep that frame in mind when I think about my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law, who are both from Baku, Azerbaijan. Born there, immigrants here. And I'm thankful. And truly, that's it. That's the engine. That's what makes America run. It was never about just you and your family. It's this whole interlocking machine where all the pieces work together and we are greater than the sum of our parts. That's the beauty of America. And it's the thing that J.D. Vance keeps looking directly at and completely not seeing it. Page 85 gives us what I think is probably this book's first outright fabrication. He describes his interaction with a young woman dressed in all black, wearing a black beret, who is scoffing at a young black teen mom. J.D. Vance deploys this scene, I assume, to say, unlike the beret people, I am a friend of the black teen mom. Therefore, I could not be a racist. Also, can we be honest about teen motherhood for a moment? 18 or 19, that's pretty young to have a kid. Younger than 18 brings on a whole other set of problems that I don't really have time to talk about in this particular video because, after all, younger than 18 tends to be a recurring problem for J.D. Vance's boss. Ooh, damn.
Fuck, that was brutal.
Having children in high school is genuinely worth discouraging, and not because teen motherhood is inherently bad, but because statistically, the outcomes are brutal. I know women personally, and I am friends with women who became teen mothers, and they will tell you that they loved being a mom and they have great relations with their kids, but it was an extremely difficult existence absent some sort of cushion or safety net from wealthy parents. A teen mom is facing some pretty stacked odds, and no one seriously disputes that. When talking about teen moms in this book, here's the thing that J.D. Vance leaves out. Teen moms need a lot of support, but he doesn't want to talk about the lack of support because it would break his entire philosophy. Teen moms need SNAP, WIC, healthcare, sometimes housing assistance, vocational assistance, the ability to get to and from work. But the party he's part of has spent the better part of the past 5 decades chipping away at the support systems that allowed teen moms to get through life. J.D. Vance only feigns and performs compassion for this teen mom for an anecdote in a book, because reality is that J.D. Vance votes against outcomes that would allow her to be a success in life and stability for her child. The beret lady, at worst, gave this teen mom a dirty look. J.D. Vance gave her a painful life. Chapter 5 introduces an interesting narrative in the book, which is the war between technology and Christianity, which I think is just a narrative that only exists in J.D. Vance's head. He also introduces the most consequential relationship in his life in this chapter, his relationship with multi-billionaire technologist Peter Thiel. Vance describes their introduction and attending a Peter Thiel lecture much in the same way that I might describe wandering into a dive bar in Cleveland. Let me decode this really quickly for the folks sitting at home. One does not simply have an audience of Peter Thiel. Being in the same room with Peter Thiel means you have already ascended some pretty lofty Silicon Valley social circles to be in a room where Peter Thiel is giving a lecture. These rooms are virtually inaccessible to every American alive. You don't just walk into a Peter Thiel lecture the same way you walk into a bar in Cleveland, Ohio, and order a PBR and throw some Matchbox 20 on the jukebox. Being in a room with Peter Thiel is something you are selected for. What's interesting here is how J.D. Vance drops this in as something of a throwaway line, and I think his audience was probably going to miss it if I didn't acknowledge it. The reason his audience is going to miss the Peter Thiel reference is because they have never experienced the childlike malevolence of Peter Thiel. This is the metaphorical paint bucket coming over the railing attached to a rope, pivoting across the banister and hitting the bad guys in the face. This is that metaphorical paint bucket. Peter Thiel is pure, unfiltered evil. And you may be thinking, so why the Kevin McCallister Home Alone reference? Kevin McCallister was a child of pure evil. He could have called 911 at any point during that film, but instead he decided to torture two people. And we know this because he called and ordered a pizza. So given the choice between calling 911 and saving his own life and torturing two admittedly bad people, Kevin McCallister decided to torture two human beings. What a fun Christmas movie for children this is. Anyway, what I mean to say is that Peter Thiel is the adult version of Kevin McCallister with billions of dollars at his disposal. J.D. Vance will get away with this throwaway line in his book about Peter Thiel because his audience does not know that Peter Thiel is an actively hostile presence towards blue-collar, working-class Americans. They simply do not understand who Peter Thiel is. Then he critiques Silicon Valley for creating things like Facebook and mobile phones, etc. And to be fair, those are fair critiques of products of Silicon Valley. The problem is he boils all technology in the United States into this one distilled idea about Silicon Valley and not the wide portfolio of technological investments that are happening in the United States. There are millions of Americans working in pharmaceuticals, biosciences, aerospace, agricultural technology, etc. These are all part of the American technology portfolio, but J.D. Vance tends to not understand that those portfolios exist. He mentions them not at all. I think the reason that J.D. Vance has a very narrow view of technology is because he's not a technologist. He's a Yale-trained attorney. And so, of course, he's going to have a misunderstanding of technology because the only technology door that has ever been held open for him was the door that was held open by billionaire Peter Thiel. And then there's this crazy line, and I had to read it like 10 times to make sure I actually understood what he was saying. He writes that people at Yale would describe themselves as socially liberal but fiscally conservative. And then he pivots to say, but God forbid anyone would say that they would like to protect the life of an unborn fetus, and compares that statement to saying you hate black people. Just so we're clear on framing here, J.D. Vance draws an equivalent line between saying I would like to protect unborn fetuses and I hate black people. And he gives both of these statements equal weight. Imagine for a moment writing that sentence and then putting it into your book. And then your editor looks at that sentence and says, yeah, we'll leave that in. To be clear, these two things are not alike. Saying you hate someone because of the color of their skin is very different than understanding a woman's bodily autonomy and knowing that pregnancy is complex and can be fraught with different medical complications, and that it's a good idea to trust doctors who are trained medical professionals to have conversations with their patients who are women about whether or not pregnancy is safe or whether or not starting a family right now is something they are choosing to do. Once again, choice, something that J.D. Vance fundamentally misunderstands throughout this book. All of this, of course, is extra rich coming from a man who just 20 pages earlier in this book was defending teen pregnancy. But he also won't allow that women should be able to start a family at the time of their own choosing. Of course, these ideas do not cohere because they were never meant to cohere. These are Christian merchandise that you sit on a shelf, like Hallmark Precious Moments figurines. Porcelain, of course, is famously cold and will not stick to things. Porcelain is also incredibly fragile, like the opinions of the fragile evangelical right. Dink. Should I do that sound effect? I don't know. Do love the analogy, though. I don't think I have anything porcelain to make that noise on into the mic. Well, I guess I'll call it a good thing that I'm not like an old lady collecting porcelain figurines. Roughly halfway through the book, we are introduced to its most interesting character in the chapter, My Favorite Year. The most interesting character is not the author of the book, J.D. Vance, but rather his wife, Usha Vance. We learn in this chapter that her dream job is Sesame Street's Sesame Workshop. She loves the idea of educational programming for kids and inspiring their imagination and play, dancing, singing, and painting. I want you to think about what this means for a moment, because in Usha Vance, we have a person whose ambitions are driven by what she actually likes and enjoys. She likes the idea of Sesame Street and Sesame Workshop because it inspires imagination and laughter. Okay, pause. Now that you've thought about what that means, also consider what this means, because J.D. Vance is part of the current administration that actively defunded PBS, thereby defunding Sesame Street, thereby crushing his own wife's dreams.
The president tweeted or socialed or truthed, Republicans must defund and totally disassociate themselves from NPR and PBS, the radical left monsters that so badly hurt our country. I have to tell you, I heard monsters and I thought of Cookie Monster.
Imagine for a moment you're sitting at the dinner table, a fly on the wall with J.D. Vance and Usha Vance, as he tells her that the twinkle in her eye, Sesame Workshop, is something that his administration just destroyed that day. Hey babe, you know that thing you love? Sesame Workshop? Well, I destroyed that today. Anyway, how was your day? I gotta say, the Vance household has gotta be the most toxic place in the world, because at least we know that Donald Trump and Melania Trump just don't talk. They don't sleep in the same bed. But my God, I cannot imagine how much Usha Vance hates being married to this guy. I also want to talk about Usha's ambition and also how J.D. Vance describes her ambition, because he describes it with this sort of surgical accuracy that doesn't typically find itself being used to describe ambition. J.D. Vance doesn't understand that Usha Vance is not test driving this ambition. She is not merely a spectator in her ambition. She wants to participate in it. Usha Vance has genuine affection for this thing, Sesame Workshop. It is what she loves. The reason he comes at ambition from this cold, surgical sort of perspective is because he has never actually experienced what it's like to have ambition himself, to be genuinely curious or to like something for the sake of liking it. J.D. Vance's only drive is the distant hope that someday he may like himself.
Oh, what a sick burn.
Usha, and I say this with compassion, is the stereotype of,
I can fix him.
She encouraged him to go to therapy and deal with his childhood trauma. She would frequently send him articles that would help his own internal voice, that weren't steeped in politics, but were more just about curiosity and ideas. And rather than engaging her, he would look at the byline and see it was the New York Times and accuse her of liberal bias. Nearly halfway through this book, she is the only character with any discernible personality or likability, and the author, J.D. Vance, seems to resent her for even attempting to give him a personality.
Maybe you're the problem.
Usha Vance encouraged J.D. Vance to go to therapy so he could overcome his childhood trauma. But J.D. Vance describes therapy as uncomfortable and something he didn't really want to do. He couldn't understand why he was paying a stranger to talk about things that he could talk about with his wife. I'd like to talk about this directly if I can for a moment, because I think it's one of the most common misconceptions about therapy. And I haven't just heard it from J.D. Vance, I've heard it from many people. The idea that your friends and family are the most equipped to talk with you about your trauma. Quite simply, they're not. They're not trained to, and more importantly, your emotional burden should not be on your friends and family. Your baggage belongs to you, not them. That's why you pay a third party. A therapist is a person who is disconnected from your life. Therefore, they can help you better see through the fog, and they are paid to consult with you for their time. And here's the funny thing. It is an entirely transactional relationship. It is a good, healthy transactional relationship. J.D. Vance spends a lot of time in this book sharing his contempt for the wealthy elites and how they have a transactional relationship with their nannies, au pairs, their house cleaners, and assistants, and yet doesn't understand that the only transactional relationship that he was uncomfortable with in his own life probably could have saved his life. Then comes a story that I think probably should have been the center of this entire book. J.D. Vance recounts this story about the time he was in the car with his mom and she was angry and her anger got the better of her and she started driving erratically and he became scared. And so he hopped into the backseat of the car. She almost wrecks and later there's some sort of court case about it, but the case doesn't go anywhere because he refuses to testify against his mom. And Usha hears this story and says, wow, that's a lot of trauma, JD. You should probably do something about that because it's clearly unresolved. So J.D. Vance goes to his therapist and he tells his therapist about this trauma. And the therapist rightly says, wow, you have a lot of unresolved childhood trauma. I'm here to get you through that. His therapist also successfully identifies the osmosis of trauma from his grandfather, who was an addict who abused his mother, and his mother being abusive to him. This is a fairly well-grounded principle, and no one in psychology will really argue against trauma by osmosis. Trauma tends to trickle downhill. I think his therapist was right in the family analysis. That's the whole thing. His trauma was generational. Of course, J.D. Vance's response to all this was extremely unhealthy. He thought that his therapist was casting him as a bit character in his own life and robbing him of all his agency, which of course is not the case. These two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have agency and also get therapy for your trauma. For those of you watching who would like to improve your lives, processing your childhood trauma or anything else that's going on in your life, a divorce, grief, etc., this requires you still doing the work. You'll have to go talk to a therapist about it, sometimes for years, if not decades. Healing is a different journey for everyone. Instead of doing the work and trying to heal from his childhood trauma, J.D. Vance walks out of his therapist's office. And the rest of this book is what walking out of a therapist's office looks like 20 years later. To her credit, Usha Vance keeps trying to help J.D. Vance form an inner self. Throughout the rest of this book, she tells him, and I quote, "You can't just fill your brain with facts and data. You need to fill it with interesting thoughts." She would then send him articles from the New York Times or some other source, and he would accuse her again of liberal bias. God, what a chud this guy is. You have this amazing wife and you just act like such a pathetic loser all the time. You've got this woman who's standing in front of a man trying to offer him this interior life, these inner thoughts, something that is bigger and more curious, and he keeps looking at the masthead like, no, liberal bias. Who is this guy?
I don't know who I am.
Then, of course, this chapter takes a hard turn into the book of Job. What else? It's this whole idea of suffering. Why do people die? Why do children get cancer? Why do dogs get cancer? Why do things happen? Why does suffering exist? Etc., etc. The book of Job is often the Bible's example of trying to make sense of all the chaos and attribute some of this to God, which, fine, I guess. But the simple answer is that life is chaos. Why do people get cancer? Because we're mammals. The same reason your dog gets cancer, some other animals get cancer. It's sad when your dog gets cancer. It's sad when we get cancer. People die. Bad things happen. It is what it is. All major religions offer a narrative for this randomness. J.D. Vance just happens to find his solace in Christianity. The chapter closes with a line that actually made me sort of put down the book and think for a second. I'm going to read this quote. "And Usha was different. She was truer and purer and more just and lovelier than anyone, because she inspired me to be better. She forced me to follow a different path. And that, more than anything, is the path that led me back to God." I want you to follow this sequence for a moment. Usha Vance meets this man, and she spends years trying to nudge him into some sort of inner voice, inner identity, sending him articles, trying to help him get therapy, to resolve his trauma. And through all of these things, rather than forming an inner self and figuring it out, he just acquires Christianity figurines as an aesthetic. This brings me to something that I want to say about this book, but also about being from the rural evangelical South. Christianity is not an identity. It's not something that you can write in a Facebook bio or a TikTok bio that tells me more about who you are. I know this because I grew up around the kind of people who put patriot, Christian in their bios of their social media profiles. And what I want to tell you is that Christian is not an identity. It's a costume you put on because you haven't developed an identity. Jesus Christ preached a gospel of servant leadership, not performative virtue signaling. Next in the book, we arrive in 2016. This is the moment Hillbilly Elegy is published, and it's the moment that J.D. Vance becomes something of a celebrity. We assume at this point he becomes a multimillionaire due to the sales of his book, and his life changes considerably. I read Hillbilly Elegy. I'll even defend parts of it. I understand the message that he was trying to convey in the book. For readers who are outside of the poor rural South or Appalachia or the Rust Belt, I'll give you a quick primer on Hillbilly Elegy and some of the ideas that it's trying to diagnose. The book Hillbilly Elegy, more than anything, is about malaise. It's about what happens when the rural South, the Rust Belt, Appalachia, experience the loss of jobs and the loss of opportunity. And in that vacuum, you find drug abuse, alcoholism, violence, families falling apart. It's genuinely not a good place to be. I will say that I do agree with J.D. Vance's diagnosis of this wound. It is just the source of the wound where we diverge. What J.D. Vance is really trying to diagnose is the death of a community, but J.D. Vance can't successfully do that because he doesn't really understand the community that he's trying to diagnose. In Communion, he describes his post-Hillbilly Elegy life with a sort of studied discomfort, and he tells us, his readers, that he could have jetted off to Europe, but he didn't want to do that. And also, he was asked to be in TV interviews, and in those TV interviews, he was asked to comment on politics, and he wasn't comfortable commenting on politics. And the reason I think he wasn't comfortable is because there was no there. The there had not yet been developed by J.D. Vance, so he couldn't form a real perspective on politics. And after this, we have the first rewrite, and I will call it the first naked, insane lie that I think we all can see right through. J.D. Vance attempts to reframe his criticism of Donald Trump as somehow a misunderstanding he had with Donald Trump and class politics, to which I say, no, dude, we were all there. What you said was on video.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
It makes you think that at a fundamental level, this is sort of a he said, she said, right? And at the end of the day, do you believe Donald Trump, who always tells the truth? Just kidding. Or do you believe that woman on that tape?
No, I cannot stand Trump because I think he's a fraud. Well, I think he's a total fraud that is exploiting these people, who is a total fraud.
Like you said, I agree with you on Trump because I don't think that he's the person. I don't think he actually cares about folks.
Definitely, there is definitely an element of Donald Trump support that has its basis in racism or xenophobia.
I think there's a chance, if I feel like Trump has a really good chance of winning, that I might have to hold my nose and vote for Hillary Clinton. I think that I'm going to vote third party because I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
And the context was there as well. You compared Donald Trump to cultural heroin. You then compared him to Voldemort. And yeah, those are not the kind of things you can easily walk back. Also, he is a Yale-trained lawyer. He's the kind of person who knows what it means to say things on the record. These were not mistakes. J.D. Vance said he was a never Trump guy. We know what that means. The only reason we are reading this book right now, and the only reason you are watching this video, is that J.D. Vance proved himself to be so subservient, so spineless, so devoid of any meaning, that Donald Trump looked at him and said, "This is the perfect person to reflect my image." To use a Christian metaphor, Donald Trump looked at J.D. Vance and he saw a jar of clay that he could mold into a step stool for fascism. On to the next chapter, called Like Father, Like Son. Midway through Like Father, Like Son, J.D. Vance speaks about his own ADHD diagnosis. And credit where credit is due, J.D. Vance, in his book, cites a real good source about why children in poverty are more frequently diagnosed with ADHD. I actually looked it up. It's by Emma Russell, Tamsin Ford, and Ginny Russell, and it's called The Socioeconomic Associations with ADHD, and it sent me down a rabbit hole, which I found fascinating. In his own book, J.D. Vance cites the Washington Post piece that talks about some of the socioeconomic conditions that contribute towards a childhood ADHD diagnosis. I'm going to be referencing my notes here and reading off the screen for a moment to make sure I get this right. But what the research actually says is basically what Vance can't afford to say. The diagnosis gap is driven by the other conditions of the poor kids' lives. These are food insecurity, housing instability, rotating parents, household chaos, and basically a household that is in chaos gets wired for hypervigilance. It gets wired to always have to be on and aware and shifting from thing to thing. Now, we don't really know why children's brains get wired for hypervigilance so easily. My own instinct tells me there's probably some evolutionary condition that means it's easier for children to be wired for hypervigilance because we are only about 11,000 years removed from the Pleistocene, and once upon a time, being hypervigilant meant staying alive when there were large animals that might eat you. I don't like oversimplifying here, but I'm limited in time that I can talk about it. But it should surprise no one that children who are in households with sober adults with both parents that are quiet and stable probably have an easier time focusing at home than do children who are in chaotic households with perhaps parents who are addicts or maybe a parent who's in and out of jail, etc. This is probably not going to surprise anyone. It is not an indictment of poverty. It is just an effect of poverty. The study that J.D. Vance cites in the footnotes of his own book is espousing policies that his party is trying to destroy: the social safety nets, the community centers, the resources for children, free lunch and reduced lunch at schools. The things in the source are saying those are the things that would help the kids with ADHD. It is mind-boggling to me that he included a source that directly contradicts his own policies. But I guess that's the poetry that is J.D. Vance, a man with no substance. Thankfully, his audience is not known for reading more than they have to, and I am probably one of the very few people that will read the footnotes and then go look at the source material. Then, Usha finds out that they're having a boy, and J.D. Vance's unresolved trauma reports for duty again. J.D. Vance assumes his son will be like him, a child who was forged in adversity, raised by parents who were abusive addicts, without understanding that he is a Yale-trained lawyer and his wife is highly educated and they are a family that has means because he is a multi-millionaire author. This is a slightly different crucible than where he was from. He writes, "At some point, Usha and I found ourselves in conversation about what type of college we wanted our son to attend. In hindsight, this seems absurd. It occurred to me that this illustrated why our society is so terrible at affording opportunities for our poor children to join the upper echelons. We were already preparing to give our future child a head start in the game of meritocracy. I know this feeling intimately. I've been there. I lived it. So I want to talk about it honestly. I used to live in a single-wide trailer in rural West Georgia. I know what it's like to get kicked out of a house because you're 6 months behind on rent and then have to move into a hotel temporarily with a box of cats. And I know what it's like to have my mom have to call her grandparents so they can get a security deposit to move into a dilapidated old house in the middle of nowhere in Barnardsville, North Carolina. I know and understand all of those things. And yet, I was able to pursue a career that allowed me the financial capability to pre-fund all 3 of my children's childhood educations. Do I feel even remotely bad about that? No, the fuck I do not. The reason I don't feel any guilt about pre-funding my own children's college educations is because I'm not trying to pull the ladder up behind me. I actively advocate for and vote for politicians who expand universal pre-K, try to reduce classroom sizes, increase teacher pay, and lower the cost of college education to make it easier for more children and more families to have access to higher education and better outcomes in their lives. J.D. Vance is more than willing to hand his children every rung on the ladder. He is a Yale-trained lawyer, a best-selling multimillionaire author, a former senator, and now the sitting vice president of the United States. He is a man with the power and legislative authority to shape policy that would make education more affordable and more accessible to children just like him growing up poor in rural Appalachia. The reason he feels guilt is because he has abandoned his roots and where he is from, and he's abandoned the children who are just like him. J.D. Vance writes this entire book in pursuit of Christianity, the sense of community that could be the solution, the sense of charity and being able to be a servant leader. If he had only understood the meaning of Christianity, the portrait he's painting of himself in this book wouldn't be filled to a surfeit with hypocrisy, but instead the portrait we get of J.D. Vance would make Dorian Gray envious for its hypocrisy. In this chapter, he also describes cutting his son's umbilical cord, which I've done 3 times. I understand. It's a genuinely joyful moment, as it should be. And in that moment where you're overcome with joy and filled with emotion, it's okay to just experience that moment and be filled with joy. You don't have to attribute it to God or any other higher power. It can just be about you having a moment with your child and realizing how important that moment is. Because every single time I've cut one of my children's umbilical cord, there was this moment of instant connection. I'm holding this little person who, at least on some level, will know kind of half of what it's like to be me. And that thing you're feeling is genuinely a wonderful, beautiful connection. And then, man, I got to talk about this pumpkin patch story because it is just bizarre and sad in so many ways. So here's the gist of this story. J.D. Vance is telling how he and Usha and their son went to this pumpkin patch, as you do sometimes in the fall, and his son selects this comically large pumpkin. And of course, it's an adorable story because kids picking out a really big pumpkin and trying to carry it is kind of an adorable story. All children do this. In this story, this should be the feel-good moment about a dad and his wife and their young son going to a pumpkin patch and just experiencing a wholesome moment together. But because this is J.D. Vance's book, of course, that's not what happens. On the drive home, Usha Vance notices that something is wrong with J.D. Vance, and so she inquires, "Hey, what's wrong, J.D.?" So J.D. confides in her that while he's driving home, he's thinking about all the things that could kill his family: mass murderers, drunk drivers, getting T-boned by a semi, all these crazy, chaotic things that could, in theory, happen, the chaos that is the world, but it's extremely unhealthy. And look, I'm not going to say that every parent doesn't understand what I will call the low-level background hum of just trying to make sure your kids stay alive. That's why I put the little child locks on the cabinets, and I've got the annoying baby gate at the top of the stairs, and we try and buy cars that crash test well. I made 2 entire automotive decisions in my life about what cars I should buy based upon almost purely their crash testing capabilities. And also, I did select the larger engine in my 7 Series because you need a twin-turbo V8 to get up hills after all. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that reasonable precautions as a parent are how you show love in a checklist form. Reasonable precaution, emphasis on reasonable, is the general fabric of just being a parent. But I want to be clear that reasonable precaution is not what J.D. Vance is describing to Usha Vance. What he is describing is crazy, catastrophic ideations that are not normal. While you are enjoying a hayride at a pumpkin patch with your child, you should not be white-knuckling this event thinking about all the things that may kill your family. That is obviously unresolved childhood trauma manifesting itself on a hayride. This is not a good way to live your life. But more importantly, I want to understand, and tell you how he's framing it in this book. Because in his book, he's trying to describe the seriousness of fatherhood and how he can protect his family from any of these things that may harm them. But that's not how it reads in the book to a normal, sane person. A normal, sane person sees him white-knuckling this hayride and thinks, my God, this man needs therapy. Years and years of therapy.
Many fucking years of therapy.
By the way, there is a version of this book that ends with that hayride, and then Usha looks over at J.D. and says, J.D., it's time for you to go back to therapy and resolve all of this trauma. And then J.D. takes that moment on the hayride and realizes, wow, I should be able to enjoy a hayride with my young son and this joyful moment in a pumpkin patch, but my childhood trauma is overriding my ability to have normal family experiences. And in that version of reality, J.D. Vance goes back to therapy and he does the work on himself, and he never becomes the vice president of the United States, and instead becomes an empathetic person who can think about other people. Unfortunately, that's not the version of events that happened, and he's the vice president today because he never did the work on himself, but I just wanted to give you an outcome of what could have happened had this been a different book. But it is not a different book. It is this book. The suggestion that I just offered never came from Usha Vance's lips, and instead we have this human catastrophe in front of us. I find chapter 8 very interesting because a lot of it has some of the most honest self-diagnosis in this entire book, because it's the chapter about Catholicism. J.D. Vance describes his attraction towards Catholicism partly through the lens of J.R.R. Tolkien, yes, the writer of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, who was a devout Catholic. However, what J.D. Vance reveals his understanding of Catholicism to be is not really my personal understanding of Catholicism. What J.D. Vance likes about Catholicism is best described as the saints, the lore, the depth, St. Thomas Aquinas, the accessory characters, the entire world of things that exists in Catholicism that doesn't exist in the same way it does in a Baptist or a Methodist church, which is just pews and a cross on the wall with Jesus. I mean, I guess, yeah, sometimes in the rural South, every once in a while, you get like a wackadoodle trying to French kiss a rattlesnake, but for the most part, it's just a focus on Jesus. Catholicism offers you side quests in Christianity. You can explore all types of different saints. There's plenty of source material and depth to explore. And to someone who doesn't have a sense of self, like J.D. Vance, all of these side quests are a wonderful way of ignoring the main story. For a man who has been perpetually shopping for an identity his entire life, Catholicism is the richest RPG that J.D. Vance could have ever booted up in his PlayStation because it offers a depth and a variety of ways to explore the game, and he can become the level 48 Appalachian jurist with all the trinkets and books and commands and spells he can imagine. And Catholicism, more importantly, allows him to deviate from the main story. It allows him to infinitely pursue side quests, which is what he does best. Here's the part that I really love the best about this entire chapter on Catholicism. He meets Father Henry. And Father Henry, after just a few months of knowing J.D. Vance, successfully diagnoses J.D. Vance in the same way I did after I read this book. And I quote, he said that it was his diagnosis from Father Henry was, quote, equal parts enraging and perspective. This is what Father Henry said. You put too much pressure on your marriage because you're too emotionally invested in Usha. Y'all, I need to break the fourth wall again. I hate that I have to keep doing this, but I'm writing notes as I'm reading this book, mind you. And so I want to read the note that I have because it's almost exactly the same as what Father Henry said. I said, me and Father Henry, quote, independently arriving at exactly the same diagnosis. This man skipped therapy and made his wife carry the entire weight of his unbuilt self. That was my diagnosis of J.D. Vance. I guess Father Henry just takes it further because if Father Henry is Nas, then J.D. Vance is Jay-Z, and this whole thing is ether. This is a takedown. Father Henry is cutting J.D. Vance at the knees in his own book. And I don't know that J.D. Vance has the self-awareness to understand that he just published ether in his own book. You will be unsurprised to find out that Father Henry says that J.D. Vance needs to stop treating Usha as his savior and must instead treat Jesus Christ as his savior, which is probably unsurprising coming from a Catholic priest. I think that Father Henry got the diagnosis right, that J.D. Vance needs to build a J.D. Vance. The solution in his prescription was to find Jesus. My prescription is that J.D. Vance just needs to become a better person and get therapy. But I will give Father Henry credit where it's due. Father Henry saw in a few months in J.D. Vance what literally hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists across the United States have failed to see in J.D. Vance for the better part of a decade. Before I really dive into chapter 9, I need to reveal something that I read by omission. J.D. Vance does not appear to have any male friends. Yes, there are stories about college drinking buddies, but beyond that, in the later chapters, I don't hear any friendships. In virtually every other biography and memoir that I have ever read, there are people, mentors, confidants, friends that the protagonist of the memoir or the autobiography will talk about. This is crazy that he doesn't seem to have this. There's no group chat. There's no boys trip. There's no anything. J.D. Vance is a man with no friends. I don't usually talk about my friendships publicly because my friends did not sign up to become characters in TikToks and YouTube videos, but I will say I feel extremely lucky that I am surrounded with a depth of friends, and while I will not name them here, you will frequently see me interact with them in the comments of the videos that I make and publish online because these are people who are comfortable interacting with me, not just in my online life, but in my real life, and sometimes they become both, and I am so thankful for that. With that said, J.D. Vance doesn't appear to have any of that. And the reason I don't think he has any of that is because a friendship requires a defined point of self. Friends don't want to go and see a reflection of themselves. You can't be a mirror and also be a friend. You must be yourself. And J.D. Vance doesn't have a point of self. The reason people become mirrors rather than people is because they're uncomfortable with their own reflection. J.D. Vance long ago should have looked at himself in the mirror and thought about improving and healing himself. And instead, he just chose to become a mirror and reflect every environment around him, which is why Donald Trump chose him to be the vice president, because he wanted someone who could reflect him. This is, and I mean it in probably the most clinical way possible, an extremely fucked up way to live your life. Chapter 9 introduces the next evolution of J.D. Vance, which is J.D. Vance, the businessman, of course. In this chapter, he opens up by attending this business roundtable event where he is rubbing elbows with CEOs and other people who are titans of industry. And the reason he's trying to do this is because Donald Trump is a businessman. And so he's trying to show that he too is a businessman. And this is an arena where he belongs. This is a perfect example of J.D. Vance trying to reflect his nearest person, in this case, Donald Trump. This is the wheel of destiny, just spinning again, tick, 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 like the price is right, and it just lands on businessman. This is where he is now. For some reason in this chapter, he does pivot away from business and into COVID, which we all experience. And in this chapter, he talks about his experience going to the grocery store and warning the cashier of the China virus as he buys a whole lot of ground beef and rice and ketchup. I cook a lot at home. This grocery list doesn't make any sense to me because I don't know what you're going to cook with that. Like meatloaf, I guess meatloaf and rice. It was a strange thing to be buying. I don't know if he made up this story or not. It seems like he's trying to make up the story to seem like he is accessible to the everyman who is perhaps stockpiling rations because they were worried and anxious about COVID. But then he also takes this opportunity to critique science, and he talks about the tyranny of government and overreach and scientists trying to take COVID too far. This to me is just another example of him pandering to the anti-scientific, super Christian base of people who don't like wearing masks during a viral pandemic. This narrative that he's putting out there serves no other purpose other than to pander to the anti-vaccine, anti-mask, anti-scientific crowd. That's it. His broader framing of COVID serves his narrative purpose, and his narrative is to be distrustful of tyranny and government overreach, but it does come at odds with his pro-life stance, because I think many of the actions we were seeing from government at that time were designed to save lives. This could be his pro-life moment if he wanted to be pro-life, but of course the Christian right is filled with hypocrisy.
I call it hypocritical bullshit.
Let's put these two positions side by side for a moment. J.D. Vance is pro-life. He is also against any reasonable measures that would have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives from a novel respiratory virus that spread worldwide. I can think of nothing more explicitly anti-life than shrugging at the scientists who are trying to prevent the spread of a novel pulmonary virus that is killing millions of people while you tell a shitty meatloaf recipe about your experience at a grocery store. But anyway, that's what he shared in his book. Pro-life, as practiced by J.D. Vance, is right up until the point you're born, and then
you're on your own now, kid.
One more thing about this chapter, and I'm not going to try and diagnose it too much. He talks a lot about his two young sons, and then there's this sort of throwaway line about the birth of his daughter, and then that's the last time we hear about it for the entire book. I'm not going to say that one little subordinate clause belonging to his daughter is a reason for me to prosecute a court case against J.D. Vance, a Yale jurist, but it is telling that this is how he chose to frame his relationship with his daughter in one sentence. I'm just saying in the way he wrote it, it's kind of telling, especially when you juxtapose it with the earlier Sheryl Sandberg stuff. The Munich section of this book is where his foreign policy brain, or really His lack of a foreign policy brain really comes into full view. He's confronted with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and he shrugs it off while he's discussing it with his colleagues, and then tries to counter his colleagues by saying, well, Vladimir Putin is really popular. His colleagues then try to explain to him that Russia's elections are basically rigged and that Vladimir Putin is a dictator, to which J.D. Vance roughly responds, well, is dictatorship really that bad? The vice president of the United States advocating for dictatorship in his own book. Okay, sure, we're just going to do that. Was there an editor here? Did anybody read this? The fact that there are multiple times in this Munich chapter where J.D. Vance just keeps drifting towards dictatorship good is a little alarming to me. It is. Then in this section, he reaches for President Eisenhower. And what he explains he understands about President Eisenhower is that President Eisenhower did make many statements about his faith and how Christianity was a guiding principle for him. Here's what J.D. Vance misses about President Eisenhower. In 1953, the top marginal progressive tax rate in the United States was 91%. That was for couples earning over $400,000 per year. Accounting for inflation and purchasing power parity, that would be about $7 million today. And the reason we did that is because in his era, people making $7 million a year were seen as a moral albatross. You didn't need to make more than $7 million a year. It didn't help you do anything for society. And so what we did is we would tax the very wealthy. And with that money, we built things like Eisenhower's 50-state freeway program, Atoms for Peace, ports, roads, bridges, affordable colleges, education, and schools, which under Eisenhower, we were integrating, a military, which we integrated. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his era, was an incredibly progressive politician. In fact, Eisenhower's tax code survived through Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Jimmy Carter. It wasn't until Reagan in the 1980s, who deconstructed and slashed our taxes to close to where they are today, that the malaise set in. It was Reagan that ultimately introduced the malaise to places like rural Appalachia. So as the jobs were outsourced and sent overseas, and the addiction and the poverty and the abuse set in, that was the environment. As all of the opportunities were all hoovered up, and in their place, we were left with Hoovervilles. J.D. Vance needs Christianity to be the driving reason for America's national success, because J.D. Vance has staked his political identity, now especially in a book called Communion, on the idea that Christianity is the reason for America's success. Therefore, his political identity must be the reason for America's success. What a strange sentence to say. The golden age of America was not built by Christianity, but it was built by a tax code that politicians like him today would call communism, going back to the earliest Munich Convention in 1963, when men were actually talking about free speech in defense of fascism as they had just defeated it 18 years prior. Instead of understanding the meaning of the Munich Conference and its roots going back to 1963, J.D. Vance wrote an entire book in service of a man who attacks the very principles that were the foundation of the Munich Conference. At some point in this book, you have to stop treating J.D. Vance's lack of self-awareness and curiosity as a feature in the book, and then understanding that this is the binding of the book. J.D. Vance's lack of curiosity, his lack of understanding, his complete unwillingness to learn things that are new is who J.D. Vance is. Understanding does not come from memorization. Memorization is a skill that he picked up at Yale Law, and rote memorization is a useful skill when passing the bar because you have to understand various torts and case law. But memorization is not meaning. Memorization and meaning are two fundamentally different things and often opposing ideas. After reading this book, I've come to one of either two conclusions about how he feels about people from Appalachia. One, he has so little self-awareness that he can't see himself as a product of that environment, or two, he has a general contempt for his peers. It's unclear which one is true at this point. Either option, no matter which way you pick it, does not bode well for the prospect of J.D. Vance maybe becoming President of the United States. Chapter 10 opens with the idea that Donald Trump may pick J.D. Vance as his running mate for his second vice presidential pick. It's his third campaign. It got awkward there with Mike Pence for a second, huh? Anyway, moving on. Why did Donald Trump choose J.D. Vance as his vice presidential running mate? Because J.D. Vance is easy to manipulate. When you read this book cover to cover, what you meet is a mark, a man with no sense of self, no identity, a man that can be persuaded to any opinion because he has no ideas on his own. He is an empty vessel. There is no thing inside of him for any idea to have a collision with because he will say yes to anything. That is because J.D. Vance has no identity. This is a book about a man who omits the fact that he changed his name twice in his adult life and doesn't bring it up at all. Odd editorial choice, but that's because, once again, he doesn't understand the idea of an identity. Heck, he doesn't have the idea what an idea is. There's a whole lot of material about the 2024 Republican National Convention and the Secret Service and his selection and him going around the United States and meeting with people at grocery stores. It's all very vanilla politician speak. There's not a whole lot of insight that can be derived from this other than he's just retelling some very bland experiences. There is a clear omission here in this entire dialogue about his travels to the United States and what it was like to be on the presidential campaign as a vice president. Through all the vanilla items about meeting with people in grocery stores and town halls and schools, what we don't hear anything about is his definition of service and how he's supposed to be serving the people and how he's supposed to earn their respect. This is the thing that I don't think he understands about public service, because once again, public service requires you to have a sense of self to understand that other people have a self that you might serve. Self-service, if you will. A man like J.D. Vance, who sees other people as either transactional or obstacles and only serves as a mirror for other people in power, cannot possibly serve other people because he doesn't understand the concept of service. The concept of service never comes up in this book because J.D. Vance's inner monologue is just a voice that says, I'll have whatever he's having. I do want to offer something of an aside here, and this is a little bit of a personal note, but I kind of get why J.D. Vance doesn't have any friends, and that's because I wouldn't want to be J.D. Vance's friend. He seems like a weird dude that I wouldn't want to be around, much less have a beer with. To use a metaphor, J.D. Vance is a plain white Ford F-150 with a bumper sticker on the back that says pro-life Christian and Comic Sans. That's it. That's the whole person. He is the least interesting person you will ever meet. Oh, what's up, guys? It's me from the future. I want to talk about how we make content here because it kind of matters. So one of my goals is that I want to be able to make content that can be thoughtful and doesn't have to be clickbaity, which I hate. I also want to make content without having to resort to sponsors that I don't like or don't want to have to endorse to do this. So here's what this means in real terms and how you can engage me. And this is, I don't know, being a little technical here, but I'm not going to have the usual sponsorships here on my channel because they just don't suit me or how I view content creation. This means I'm going to need you guys to do something a little different. I have two ways you can work with me here. The first is just buy me a cup of coffee. Go to shanemorris.sucks/coffee and you can pitch in a few bucks to buy me some coffee. It takes a long time to edit these videos, shoot the videos, write the scripts, do the research, even buy the book. In this case, when I was doing the J.D. Vance Communion book, I had to buy that damn book. Oh my God, I feel so weird giving him money. The other option is stuff you can buy. So go to shanemorris.sucks/things. I like the Shop My links because I can actually endorse things that I like. I have strong opinions about stuff that don't really matter and would definitely not fit into YouTube format. For instance, the cutting board you see there, I like a thick cutting board. I don't like the thin cutting boards, especially the wooden ones, because they warp over time and they get a little unstable on the counter. So I like the thick cutting board because they don't warp and then they just stay flat. I know it's a little thing, but it matters, and that's why I like that cutting board, and that's why you can buy it at shanemorris.sucks/things. Like the Nikes I'm wearing? shanemorris.sucks/things. I wear a lot of different kind of classic Nikes, some Cortezes. These are some SBs. Because, obviously I'm out skateboarding. I don't have the longboard. This has just been mine for years. But I encourage you to get into longboarding. It's fun. It's good exercise. You should wear a helmet, even though I'm not. You should. I almost fell and busted my ass a second ago. I'm probably not going to include that in the edit, though. So here's my promise to you. If you go to shanemorris.sucks/things or shanemorris.sucks/coffee, I don't have to take sponsorships from gambling companies or these other market betting companies. I don't have to sell you websites and VPNs. I can just make content the way I want to make it for thoughtful, smart people, and I don't have to be riding the algorithm or hope things take off. We can just do it in a real organic way where it feels like it's me and you having a relationship rather than me and then these sponsors. And then the other thing that's kind of cool about me selecting products on shanemorris.sucks/things is that everything you see there, the mixing bowls, everything is something that I actually purchased. I was really hoping that was going to be my landscaper because my grass is so long. It's not. Just another loud diesel truck. And as always, like the video, comment on the video, get into arguments with each other in the comments on the video. Engagement really helps. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm obviously new to the YouTube machine, but I'm not new to making content. This is just the first long form stuff I've done, so I'd appreciate it if you guys could support it. If you really like this video, next week I'm going to have part 2 of the whole J.D. Vance communion discussion. I've already got it shot. I just got to edit it. It takes a long time. I'm not a professional editor. Thanks for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time. Whee! Skateboards away like a total badass.